going to talk about, I know time said worming, but we're going to talk about parasites today. I thought, first of all, you need to think about what you want to know, because I want you to leave this session feeling like you've learned something. It might only be one thing, but if we learn something new every day, something useful, we're all going to improve. So if you just jot something down that you want to know from the session, just the next 30 seconds, that'd be really useful. Just have a quick think. It might be a specific problem. I suspect the outcome will always be the same, and that's to have no worms in your alpacas. But yeah, perhaps note a specific problem you want to talk about. And then we're going to really evolve through this talk about how we're going to try and solve your problem. So as I tell my students, vetting isn't always about knowing the answer. It's about going back to your basics, your first principles, and trying to work through problems and thinking about the best solution for the animal and for the consumer. So in a brief summary, these are things I think you want to know. And I think all of your questions will probably come under this. So how do I know I have a parasite problem? How can I treat a parasite problem? And how can I have a parasite-free herd? And I mean no routine treatments. So these are quite big, sizable things to talk about. And as I said, I expect all your problems have come under those three things. If not, again, please share in the chat. I think that's what the aim is tonight. The less we have to bother the animals, the less we have to treat them, the cost implications, the less we have to treat also due to resistant problems as well, the happier we'll all be. Now, what you want to know, what you need to know are often different things. Okay, so I think these are things you need to know, or we as your vets need to know, so then we share to you the information, and I'm trying to, in these slides, pull out the relevant information from each of these, so you can go home with some knowledge. So first of all, you probably need to know what a parasite is. And then you need to have a rough idea what are the life cycles. And that really helps you when you're trying to think about when the problem is going to occur, who the problem is going to affect, and also what treatments do you need to give and when. And it also affects you with your testing. There's no point testing for flu eggs in the summer because you won't have any. I can guarantee your result will be 0 and you've just spent £20 and you're no further forward. How does the parasite enter a herd? Okay, do they run along the ground? The answer is no. All right, but then, so then we try and think about how, by knowing that, we're going to think about how actually going to prevent it from entering the herd. And then how do you diagnose the problem? So who are we going to test? Think about which of the suspects is going to give us the most likely give us the result we want. And by the result I want, I mean not a positive result. I mean a result that's representative of the herd and the problem we might be facing. And then what tests to do. So we might talk a bit about fluke testing, but also masters versus modified stoles. Treatments, who, what, and when. So that often depends on your aim. It's often if you've got parasites in your herd, you're never not going to have any parasites. You never break that chain. You want to minimise your parasite burden so you don't have clinical effects, and you also want to reduce your treatments again, so for convenience and stress to the animals, also to potentially reduce resistance from developing. And then we talk a bit about prevention. So if you do want to have a parasite-free herd, which I said we all think is the aim, that would be a good thing to do. Right, so here we go. So I'm going to open this up to you. Very basically, what is a parasite? We're going to start with the basics. So to anybody who gives an opinion what a parasite is, and I don't want any names, but just have a think about what is a parasite. And if needs be, think about parasites. Think about what parasites are affecting your herd currently. So does anybody want to suggest in the chat or put a hand up?
It seems to work, so I guess it's... No, it's just there's no lights on it at all. It's not connected somehow, I'm sure. No.
All right, any ideas?
For me, I'm totally brand new to this. I've only had alpacas for, well, since August. So this is all brand new for me. So I'm learning as I'm going along,
Yeah.
and a parasite appears. Well, I've had my fecals done, and the parasite that is in my herd, the egg count is very low, but it's a type of parasite that sits on the inside of the stomach and sucks the blood from the stomach. That's the kind of parasite that I've learnt about first. So whether there's any other parasites that I need to obviously be aware of, then
Yeah, that, I think you probably named the one that's uppermost in everybody's thoughts when you think about parasites and alpacas, and probably the one that has the most publicity in some ways because of the clinical effects that are seen. And even this evening, we've had a vet on the phone with an alpaca with a low blood cell count, likely due to this parasite. But I will tell you what, and I haven't written this in the presentation, this brings up to a good point. The client had done the most annoying thing. They had wormed the alpaca without taking a fecal sample. So it's very hard to diagnose worms after you've treated them. I understand wanting to potentially save costs, etc. But if you worm an animal and then you've got a low PCV, you can never really tell you the definitive answer because you can't look for, and the parasite you're talking about is Homunculus. So actually, that's a really good point to raise, and I didn't put it in the presentation, but please take fecal samples before you worm a sick animal, and then we can always check it. Perhaps on a Saturday it's not very well. You worm it, I understand the needs and the importance to worm it quickly, but then take the fecal sample and drop it on the Monday, because then I can say, yes, it is Homunculus, or I was like, oh, you've got no worms and a low PCV, we need to look for something else. All right, so that would be really useful. Okay, so we've got Homunculus down there, yeah. So Homunculus is a type of strong valve. So that is the one we all know and talk about, but there are lots of other ones, like Teledossasia, Cuperia. I don't expect you to know the names.
it was Metadiris.
Oh, no, Metadiris, was it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Ah, okay. That's a slightly different life cycle, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's also an important one to know. And we can talk about specifics of that one as well later if you want.
Okay.
What other types have you come across?
For me, I haven't come across any just yet.
That's
That's
good.
the only one.
Of course, there's the liver fluke.
Yeah, great. So you might, liver fluke are a type of trematode. Okay? Liver fluke, I think that's the big category. So you've got what we call the gut worms, haven't we? So I said Teledossasia, Osteotasia, Cuperia, Homunculus, and you've got your liver fluke. And I think the other one's quite relevant is the coccidia. So coccidia is still a parasite, and by coccidia, I think the one that you're thinking about is Eimeria. EMAC is probably what you've heard of. The one parasite I'm not going to talk about actually that bothers you all is the external parasite. So we're going to talk about an internal parasites today. We're not going to talk about ectoparasites. Okay, so that's mange, okay, Coreoptes, and that troublesome thing. But in some ways, you can apply the same principles that we're going to talk about today. So, so I'm just going to admit a couple of people into the room. So, I came up with a very simple list. So yeah, we had strong gulls, the worms, the trematodes, the liver fluke, and we had coccidias such as EMAC. Now life cycles. Now I don't expect you to know these life cycles, but there's a few take-home points in them, and I think it really helps to explain to you why the parasite's a problem and when it's a problem. So strong gulls, and this includes the barber pole. They have 5 stages, which take at least 3 weeks to complete. So it means once they're infected, once they consume an egg, it's going to take at least 3 weeks for them to become adults and lay eggs themselves. And that's important to know because if an animal's infected, you're not going to be able to diagnose the egg problem or the problem for 3 weeks because it takes that long for them to produce the eggs, which we count in the feces. It's also important to know that because if you are doing a worm egg count reduction test, so if you've got worms and you say, right, I'm going to treat them, and I want to know my worm has worked. So if you give a wormer, you should have a 95% reduction in your fecal egg count, which proves you haven't got any resistance problems, or that you administered it properly or gave the correct dose, so that the worm has been effective. If you leave that fecal egg count for 3 or 4 weeks, you will not have an accurate representation if your worm has worked, because they will have, in that time, they could have consumed more worms, which are then laying eggs again. So if you're going to do a drench reduction test, if you're going to check your worm has worked, you need to do it 2 weeks after giving the worm. With strong gulls, they can arrest at the L4 stage in the autumn and then restart in the spring. So I've said there's 5 stages of the parasite, and they're very clever. You know, parasites are very good at adapting, living in all sorts of situations, is that they can arrest at the L4 stage in the autumn and then restart their molting into L5 in the spring. That means that today's a perfect example. I don't know if any of you woke up to frost this morning and had to de-ice the car. But they stop at that stage and think, oh, it's too cold outside. I'm going to stay here. It's nice and warm for the winter. And that means that no matter how hard your winter, and it could kill every parasite outside, you're still going to have parasites inside the animal. And then they'll lay those in the spring, and that will suddenly restart. And suddenly you've got parasites in your pasture again. That's why it's quite important to worm around this time of year and worm everything, because you hopefully will obliterate the ones inside the animal. Hopefully the weather will do its job and obliterate the ones outside the animal, and then you'll have really reduce your parasite burden come spring. So I've said that this is how you can maintain a worm burden even when external conditions are not suitable. Strong gulls, as all the parasites we're going to talk about this evening, are transmitted fecal-orally. So that is when the animal's grazing and they consume the feces. And so if you think about it, that's quite a good way of thinking about how am I going to prevent transmission and prevent spread within my herd. They can spread between species. So again, it's important to think about prevention. And when we think about species, I have to say the only other species I tend to see alpacas grazing with, apart from llamas, is sheep. And sheep are pretty tough. They can have loads of parasites, doesn't bother them. And if a parasite had that, an alpaca had that parasite burden, they would be in big trouble. So you can't really treat this animal as the same animal. In no way whatsoever. Sheep are designed for our climate. Alpacas are designed for a lovely dry climate. But they don't have parasites, and so they don't have much innate immunity against them.
Can I just ask if sheep were grazing in an adjacent field? Is there a possibility of transmitting the parasite into our field, basically?
Technically, if they poo through the fence, I mean, but
right, okay, that's yeah.
The parasites aren't going to crawl through
right.
people's
Okay.
The other thing to think about, I think when people think about worms, particularly farm vets or people from that sort of background, think, oh, it causes diarrhea. We know the barber's pole doesn't cause that. It munches all the red blood cells and causes anemia. But you'll find when animals absorb water, they absorb it in the large intestine. Parasites affect the stomach, C3, and they affect the small intestine. Because the large intestine is unaffected, and alpacas are so good at absorbing water, you don't really see what people call diarrhea in alpacas. You tend to see weight loss and ill thrift. You'll see a softening of the feces, but you certainly won't see diarrhea as you see in other species. I said because their large intestine is so effective at absorbing all water that they consume. So often I find that, and I understand why, is people miss that clinical sign of a soft feces. When alpacas defecate, it should all be firmly pelleted. It shouldn't squidge in your hand, really. If it does, it might be due to other things such as a recent change of diet, but that can be a suspicion that something isn't quite right. It should come out in pellets. If it comes out like a big oblong blob, that isn't normal. Homuncus, which is the barber pole, the blood-sucking one, has a very high fecundity. So this means it can lay 10,000 eggs per day in the right conditions. So you can see why a problem soon occurs, because suddenly it's like, oh, it's nice and sunny. It's quite dry. I'm going to lay loads and loads and loads of eggs. And the excretion of these eggs is so high, and the replication and the multiplication is so great. This is why homuncus can suddenly become a big problem very quickly. Trematodes and fluke, the essential part of their life cycle is when the eggs hatch, the radii, which is, so they hatch to the radii, they have 6 hours to find a snail. Now, this isn't your common guide snail, it's Limea trunculata. Okay, and it's a tiny little mud snail. So that is the stage that we need to know about, because that's the stage where if you have no snail, or they can't find a snail in 6 hours, you'll stop the fluke life cycle. So when people say you need warm, wet conditions for the life cycle to be completed, what they mean is they need those conditions for snail to want to live there. Okay, so one thing we talk about with trying to prevent fluke is having even fencing off wet areas of the place where you think you're going to find the fluke. I have a lot of people who think they're going to have a fluke problem because they've got wet land. A, are there any in the pasture? And if your animals don't have fluke, there shouldn't be. And B, will those other snails even present to complete the cycle to allow the fluke to become radii, enterocarya, metacercaria, and that's when they're eaten by the alpacas and then consumed. So the problem slightly with fluke is the length of time it takes for us to find some eggs. So once the life cycle is completed, and it takes about 6 weeks for the parasite to reach the liver, a further 6 weeks for the parasite to migrate through the liver, and that's where it causes the most severe clinical effects. And then another 6 weeks to start laying eggs. So if your alpaca has got fluke eggs, it's, pardon me, an error there, sorry. It should say, so from ingestion to egg laying takes 6 to 18 weeks, sorry. That should say 18 to 22 weeks. Okay, I'll change that when we handle the presentation. But what I mean is, so if you've got fluke eggs, your alpacas had the parasite for 18 weeks already. Okay, so quite a long time. Eggs are excreted onto pasture when they hatch and conditions are suitable. So again, in some ways, it's quite easy to try and stop this cycle. But I think you'll find the problem with fluke is that people don't reach a diagnosis because the fluke eggs are quite hard to find. And the tests that we use in species such as cattle, actually they look for protein specific to ruminants. And alpacas are not ruminants, so the tests don't work. So really, the only way to diagnose fluke is by fecal egg counts. And as you see, that happens long after the event of them actually ingesting the parasite. Coccidia, such as Limeria species, much more basic in that they excrete into the environment, so fecal oral transmission. And the important thing to remember to these is that they have varying prepating periods. So the prepating period is that period between ingestion and egg laying. Now, in some of them, so in pigs, there's some that take a week. The one we talk about in cattle takes 17 days. EMAC, the one you're all concerned about, takes 30 days. So I can guarantee if you do a fecal egg count on a cria that's 20 days old, you'll never find EMAC. But you might have EMAC, it just isn't in a stage of egg laying yet. So it's important to remember that a negative result doesn't mean you do not have the parasite. It means you do not have the parasite at the stage where it can lay eggs. Coccidia in particular replicate in the immunologically weak and naive animals such as crias. And these animals, when they have a poor immune system, also produce more oocysts. So not only are they more likely to get the disease, they're more likely to infect others because of the number of parasites they excrete. So how does a parasite enter a herd? And really there aren't many answers, which is good. It means we can try and prevent it. So it's either brought in animals. And when I say brought in, I mean anything that enters the premises for a day. So I think the big chat between alpaca vets at the moment is mating, the mating season. You taking your female to see a sire, a stud male somewhere, and she's just grazed somewhere for 15 minutes. That's enough time to consume parasites, which they will then bring back and excrete onto your farm. Okay. Other species as well are a good way of bringing parasites into a herd. And that could be a species they could graze with, or that could be past grazing. And by past grazing, I mean the last year or two max. Nemsdarius, we found can survive for 2 years on the pasture. It was 5 years ago. If no animal's been in that pasture for 5 years, you'll have no parasites. And that you are the people who have the chance to have a parasite-free herd.
Can I just ask, do alpacas contract parasites from deer? Or can they contract them from deer?
I will say yes, certainly fluke they can, yeah. Fluke,
right.
I think you get fluke, we can get fluke. Horses
okay.
Get fluke, pigs can get fluke. All right.
Okay.
Yeah. So So that's how parasites enter a herd. So they come in, they're not crawling on the ground, as I said, they have to come in within another species or within that same species. Then think about how do we diagnose a worm burden or an animal with worms. We always say look at the animal. That's what we teach the students and we teach anybody. You know your alpacas better than I know your alpacas. And so you need to think, doesn't look quite right. And quite right is not a scientific word, it's slightly subjective, but it is significant, especially alpacas, which you get to know them individually, they have personalities, you know what's going on. Are they slow to eat? Are they last to come on to eat? I think that's a bit strange. There could be a whole host of reasons, but even parasites can cause that, because that might be a start of a problem, perhaps causing a bit of pain and affecting the animal's behavior. So when you look at the animal, is it weight loss? You need to condition score your animals regularly. I'd suggest every month, ideally, and less for those that are heavily pregnant. Weighing obviously is the gold standard and really tells us what's going on. And remember, you've got a lot of you have growing animals. A pregnant female should be heavily pregnant female should be heavier than she was at the beginning. And I've come across people who are like, oh, they're fine, they're the same weight they were 6 months ago. And it's like, yeah, they're now heavily pregnant. And this animal should have gained weight. So just think about that. Same with growing animals. Your creation should be gaining weight every day. Now, if you wait every day, you can be watching a pot boil. But I think your youngsters, your creators should be weighed every week, and they should be putting on 1 kilo or so. And like static, nothing, no weight gain in a week is really weight loss. It means I'm not eating enough to meet my needs. I'm eating enough just to fight off everything. I'm not eating enough to actually grow. As I said before, look at the soft feces. In terms of fecal egg counts, we talk about modified stoles versus McMasters. Now, we really encourage modified stoles, and I know it's more expensive and time consuming because it's more sensitive. So by that, I mean that if I've got 10 eggs in a gram, modified stoles will find it, the McMasters won't. You think, well, what's 10 eggs? But 10 eggs is telling you do have parasites on your pasture. So that immediately things, right, I have parasites. One of these could have lots. But actually, alpacas being alpacas, even low end, if I have a really sick alpaca, I don't want it to have any parasites, because even they're going to affect his ability to digest and utilize foodstuffs properly. So I want them gone. A lot of times doing alpaca medicine, we're finding right problem there, right, treat it, remove it from differentialist. It's a process of starting with the most common things, and worms are the most common problem in sick alpacas. The McMasters is great. It's quick and cheap, but there's always drawbacks, and that's only sensitive down to 100 eggs per gram. So if your alpaca, God help it's got 3,000 eggs per gram, A, it'll be very sick, but B, the McMasters will pick it up. The other thing with modified stoles is it's particularly good at picking up the EMAC that we're concerned about, and that's really important when we're thinking about careers, I think, and pregnant animals, that we don't want to excrete the parasite onto the pasture, which then the careers will consume. You also need to think about, will they be producing eggs? So we've talked about fluke already. They don't produce eggs until 18 weeks after they've been ingested. And but also think about, as I said, a new career under 30 days, or any animal's not looking quite right. No eggs. Perhaps it's just got infected. The parasites are doing their worst. They're going from L1 to L2 to L3 to L4. Or it's consumed L3, but L3 to L4. And then they might not got to the point yet of producing eggs, or they're just starting up. So if you really think a parasite problem might exist, you need to repeat it in a couple of weeks' time. Okay. If you think a parasite problem exists and you can't find the eggs, you treat it, you're never going to know what happened. You think like, oh, well, it's still not better. Well, let's repeat. There's no point in repeating the egg count, because your parasite, your parasite control should have worked at that point. So, and it's easy for me to say, but try. It's an animal sick, it's sick, but just think about it. You can never really get an answer once you've given them the treatment. who to test. Now, as your vet, I'd love you to test every animal individually, because that is the gold standard. But I understand that cost and convenience do play a part, and it's important that we remember that. One thing I'd love to do is actually do some more post-mortems. I know often they're your pets, you've known them for a long time, they're your friends. That's the most useful information we can ever get, is actually look inside the animal. Now, it might not have died because of worms, but it will give us a good indicator of the herd. So sadly, if an alpaca's died, it probably was sick beforehand, perhaps immunosuppressed. So if you've got parasites, that's the one that's going to have it. So by looking aside, we can look for fluke. And then it's useful to know, because like, I found fluke in this animal. It hasn't died of fluke, but it's got fluke. If you have fluke on your premises, we need to think about fluke prevention and fluke control. The not knowing is so annoying for you and for us, because we can't really give you firm information. You want to know specific treatments. You know, you have a dead alpaca there. If we're able to look inside of it, just look at the C3. Oh, there's signs of parasite damage. Oh yes, there's fluke in the liver. We can just be more. We can have treatment and prevention plans that are applicable just to you, not to any alpaca herd in the country. As I've already mentioned, when you're going to test, they must not have been wormed within the last 3 weeks, because the parasites they will have consumed in that time period since they were worms will not have had time to actually lay eggs, or be more than 30 or less than 30 days old, I should say, sorry, if for EMAC. And I'll reiterate again, a negative result does not mean no worms have recently infected, and I suggest you retest these animals in 2 weeks if you think it has parasites, but a fecal egg count gave a low result as infection may be recent. I do find this is a classic with EMAC or any coccidia. I have farm vets phone me up, oh, I've got, it looks like a calf's got diarrhea, but a coccidia count 0 or low. I'm like, well, it's 14 days old. Coccidia aren't at the point yet where they'll be laying eggs, so you need to repeat it in a week's time, and suddenly in a week's time you've got a massive count, and coccidia is your problem. If you're going to group test, then test as a strata. So test the pregnant females. Even test the pregnant females of a certain age, if you've got that many. Test the cria. Don't put a castrated male with a pregnant female in a cria. Your cria, or your pregnant female, might have a worm count of, 1,000, really sick. Your pet male may have a worm count of 10, and your cria of 100. Add them together and divide by 3. You've got an average around 300. You're like, oh, why is she so sick? A worm count 300. Now, so you're going to skew your results. So a sick animal, please do individual, but even monitoring, please, test in strata. Okay, so I said, look at animals. Are they the same stage of life, same stage of gestation, same sort of health status? Okay, if one's losing weight and one isn't, grab it from the one that's losing weight. I want to know the worst case scenario. If you know the worst case, we can treat properly. If you can't catch any alpacas and grab the castrated male and take food from him, like, oh, I've got no worms. He's got no worms. In terms of treatment, we need to think about who are we actually going to test. So we need to think clinically effective of the obvious cases. I have an animal with weight loss, soft feces, high worm count. Then also we might want to test those most at risk, such as cria and young dams within the herd. So we know that certain animals are susceptible to parasites, but also those with certain conditions are. So if you co-graze, you can't really not, and you've got parasites in your herd, you can't really not treat the crias and pregnant dams within the herd, because you've got these parasites being excreted, and they're the ones who will be susceptible to them. They're the ones who perhaps will, I talk a bit about it at the end, perhaps have poor nutrition, bottom of the pile, literally have to eat round the piles of poo. They're the ones who are going to pick up the parasites. So, I've got 30 animals. I don't want to worm them all. I don't got a big worm burden, but there are worms in my herd. The crias and the dams, they need to be prioritised because they're most at risk. And you're not going to be able to stop them getting, to the point of parasites. They're always going to have access to them. And in there, the parasites are going to go, oh, you can't fight me off. I'm going to replicate. I'm going to increase my numbers, pump out the eggs, clinically affect you, and then I'm going to spread more infection amongst the herd. Okay, so treating all can be a bit of a mission. I suggest it's worth it in October, November time when the L4 stage arrests to ensure no parasite overwinters in the animals, thus reducing your parasite burden in the spring. The neonates are born in the spring, and they're going to come along with their pro-immune status. Sorry, someone's joined us. With their pro-immune status, and they're going to cause the parasite burden to increase dramatically as they produce lots of eggs. Just ask any sheep farmer. When all the lambs are born, not only are the dams immunosuppressed due to the fact they're producing milk, so they can't fight off the parasites, all the lambs running around are starting to eat grass, and they get parasites and they multiply rapidly. So you can easily, your parasite burden will just exponentially go up because there's all these immune animals to feed and to feed on and to take advantage of. All right, so just think about the individual, and I would also perhaps add the old, the oldest ones, your old pet, the one's a bit arthritic, doesn't move very quickly, is last to the feed trough, they also need some special treatment. But that's why it's worth weighing animals fairly regularly, because you can then implement them and treat them early on in the disease stage. What treatments? So levamisoles, yellow drenches are toxic and correctly dosed and must have an accurate weight. So I have to say I tend to play chicken and shy away from those. You need to think about oral versus injectable. So a lot of you will be using injectable drenches, ivermectins, to treat scab. So you try and avoid these because you don't want to overuse them and cause resistance. Oral drench, so injectable drench, but an oral drench is more effective at clearing parasites from the gut, definitely. I know why people try and avoid them, because you've got the stress of doing it to the animal, the risk of it going down the wrong pipe. But when I've certainly handled with the monkus, the injections don't always cut it. The oral drench almost seems to just gets to the point, gets where the problem is, and kill the parasite more effectively. I know a lot of you use closantel and nitroxinil, which are both flucicides. They treat chronic fluke, and they can also be used to treat a monkus because they are blood-sucking parasites. So they treat parasites that drink blood. So the other strong guys we talk about, such as Teledosage or Nemestiris, they don't drink blood, so that's why these flucicides are ineffective against them. One thing I would say to you is, do you know you have homunculus? So, it's very difficult to diagnose homunculus from a fecal egg count. You have to be very specific in your measurements, and you almost have to make it so specific that if your homunculus is on an angle, a bit of a tilt on your screen, you won't get the proper measurement. And we're talking nanometers, we're talking about such tiny, tiny areas that I think it's very difficult for someone to say, or very brave, I should say, of them to say, oh, I can tell you've got strong girls that are homunculus. There's lots of strong girls, so it doesn't have to be homunculus. Now, if you said, oh, my animal's also a bit pale, and we did a blood test and said, well, your blood cell volume, your packed cell volume is reduced to 15%, and you've got worms, that to me looks like you probably have got an homunculus problem. But a lot of people, I know, use closantel and nitroxinil because I've got worms, I better treat for Barber's pole, blah, blah, blah. You're treating for nothing else then. And I know why you do it to try and reduce resistance to your clear drenches, but you need to make sure you've only got homunculus. If you've got strong gars or other things, ineffective. Okay, Nemestiris, ineffective. So closantel nitroxinil was great if you have a diagnosed worm problem and a low PCV. Together you can diagnose homunculus. It might be, and this will be a bit of an expense, you send your worms or your eggs off and we hatch them out and have a look. And say, oh yeah, there was Barber's pole there. You've got it. We might say, no Barber's pole, so your nitroxinil and closantel has been really ineffective in this time period. Again, it's about knowing what you've got. Zolvix can be given once a year to remove all worms, and that's coming from the SCOPS principle. So if you want to know some principles about parasites, SCOPS, which is the Sustainable Control of Parasites in Sheep, you can Google SCOPS, and they do recommendations for sheep farmers And the principles are often nearly the same as with alpacas. We just have to be a bit more attention to the individual needs of an alpaca, I'd say, than a sheep. Resolvix is a treatment given, and now it's recommended to give it once a year to all sheep to just clean them out. It's a anthelmintic that's only been around for a couple of years, and so there's very, very little resistance to it. The difference with alpacas is that you need to give 3 times the sheep dose. So you need to give 7.5 mg per kg as opposed to 2.5 mg per kg as you would in a sheep. That's why I quite like to use around this time of year. The ones treat all and just clean it out. Flukicides. So triclobenzol for the acute stages of the fluke. So as we said, around June is when you're going to get your eggs hatched in moist conditions, and then 18 weeks on from there, you know, we're looking around August, September. We're really going to have acute fluke. Again, as I've told you, we can't really diagnose it without actually doing the post-mortem. You can use Closanto or nitroxanil, as we said, to remove chronic stages of fluke after Christmas. And this will stop egg production, and that will stop infection of the pasture, and that hopefully will stop further fluke being produced next year. I have anecdotal evidence of triclobenzol killing alpacas with high fluke burden. So the only advantage is we've ended up doing a post-mortem and found the fluke, like, oh yeah, you have got fluke, but I'm afraid I don't have any tips. You're going to have to fluke the animals. Don't give a half dose that causes a resistance. But I've seen animals that have high fluke burdens, and I think the triclobenzol just killed all the fluke, and that's made the animal sick and sadly killed the alpaca too. It might be that the alpaca is going to die anyway, regardless if you gave the triclobenzol. Just be wary. I've heard of and seen animals that were given triclobenzol for the acute stages of fluke, and it has killed them. And on post-mortem, they've had high levels of fluke in them. There is only treatments for EMAC for coccidia, so Baycox at the sheep dose. Okay, yeah, that works. Toltrazuril, that works best. You can get diclazuril in this country. Not so effective against EMAC. So Vicoxin is not so effective. Baycox is much more effective. If you're in the States, you can have Amprolium, but we don't have that in this country. So when to do the treatment? So the simple answer is when clinical disease is diagnosed. So clinical disease means you have a worm burden that's been detected and you have effects. Now, we can question whether that's essential or whether that's true, because personally, I would say if you have any of the parasite in a critter or heavily pregnant animal, I would probably treat anyway, because I don't want them affected. The others can have a bit of worms. It might keep the weight down on some of them, but also it will keep your population in your herd going round and maintain what we call a susceptible population. You might have been told about resistance, and if we worm, we're always going to have resistance. The one way of not having resistance is to maintain some animals with the low worm burden that you never treat. These will then maintain their susceptible worms. So perhaps if you do have a clinically sick animal, you can be quite happy to have worms that will respond to your worm treatment. What is a high burden? Good question. So I've already told you this evening that if I have a sick alpaca and they have a worm burden of 100, I treat that as high because I want to get rid of that problem. But if I have a really healthy animal, like a male castrated alpaca with a high worm count of 200-300, and it's healthy and not losing weight, I normally leave that alone. Okay. The other time is to do at periods of high risk. So if I know I've got fluke in my alpacas, I will use triclobenzol every 6 weeks during the autumn time to make sure I don't have acute stages of fluke. As I keep telling you, the other times I do it would be when I've got pregnant animals, so to reduce shedding to clear at foot and to do the careers as well, especially if they're co-grazed. All right. Sorry. Next one. Okay, prevention. So knowing the history of the land is the most important thing. So that means when you take on some land, what's been on it before, any other species, if another species has been there for 5 years, you will not have parasites in that. The other way is to have a new lay. So you basically pull up the land and start again, and then you're starting at 0. Don't co-graze. So don't graze other species, particularly ones that can pop up more parasites, but also ones that can cope with a high parasite burden. So as I said to you already, if your sheep's there thinking it's fine, it can be pumping out the worms, and your alpaca comes along and it can't deal with that level of worm burden and suddenly becomes very sick. Okay. And really try not to buy in. And so when you buy an animal, stable it and treat with injectable ivermectin, Zolvix, and triclobendazole, and stable for 72 hours. The feces from that then needs to be removed from your premises. Don't then chuck the feces out in your field, because that will have all the parasites from that animal. You don't need to do a worm egg count, because what we're trying to do is stop you buying in any parasites, and particularly any resistant parasites. So we don't actually care. If I did a worm egg count and found an animal bought and had like 10 worms, that won't clinically affect it, but it might have 10 resistant worms that you never want to enter your pasture, so we treat them regardless. And it's the one time you're allowed to give all the treatments. And then we talked about the mating season. Personally, I prefer it when you take animals off to be mated, they stayed in a stable, concreted floor, and if any come to you, they stay in a stable as well. Just don't knot in the pasture. I mean, if they do, please ensure that you poo pick, right? And then worm your own animal when it comes back. But please be aware, the animals moving across the country for mating, it's very easy to see how parasites are spread amongst other diseases. Prevention, so this is reducing exposure. I didn't put poo picking here, so please all poo pick. Got a quiet day, something to do. So don't co-graze all ages, if possible. Because again, you've got your animal that hasn't had a career for 5 years alongside someone else's career, and they have different levels of immunity. Some can cope with, some can't. Don't co-graze species. Try and maintain a low stocking density. So I've had people with problems and nothing's changed. What's happened? I was like, something has changed. You're having an extra 10 careers every year and you're not selling it anymore. Your stocking density is increasing. So you want around 6 alpacas per acre. This doesn't sound very much, does it? Ensure adequate nutrition. So animals that have got poor nutrition, perhaps are not having enough protein, or actually access to food, so losing weight, so enough trough space. And again, this comes up when you increase numbers or due to bullying and hierarchy in the herd. You know, your pregnant female at 2 years old, she's a prime candidate. She's bottom of every pile. She's got a career inside, taking everything out of her. And she's not even getting access to food because the 10-year-olds bumped her off it. So you need to make sure you've got adequate trough space. Reduce disease in your herd. I know the disease is often worms, but a diseased animal, as I said, is more susceptible to parasites. It will then produce more eggs, and that will then spread it to others within the herd. Don't breed for animals with persistent burdens. So those, in time, and we're talking about it more and more with sheep in particular, we actually select rams now for resistance to parasites. And so we're going to try to breed in these traits to try and help reduce our burdens. But you know, I haven't talked about scab today, but scab, you know, if I have a persistently infected animal, I do tend to recommend sadly euthanasia, because you will not cure it, but it'll also always act as a source for others in the herd. And worm all in late autumn to reduce overwintering within C3 and therefore reduce the spring worm burden. Someone at the beginning did mention Nemestyrus. That really affects the young. So if I've got Nemestyrus on a pasture, and for the same, you can also use EMAC for the same principles. If I have separate grazing for animals, my careers and my will go on my new pasture, or the one that wasn't grazed the year before. So if you have separate pastures, you go crea, then females, pregnant youngsters, pregnant females, and then end of the line, when everyone else has been on and put their parasites on, then you put your low stress animals on, your castrated males, your old females. Okay, don't graze your oldest animals on a pasture. Let them crap all over it, so parasites, and then put your cria on afterwards. Okay, you need to maintain your clean pasture for your cria, and that means that when you move them on, you need to worm the females to make sure they don't actually introduce more parasites in that pasture. Okay, so think about order of way things go. Many of you co-graze, and that's absolutely fine, and you just accept that you're going to have to worm your pregnant females and crias more often because they're going to be exposed to parasites that others have and then can cope with. All right, I think that's enough. Okay, so there are questions in the chat, so I'll have a look at the chat in a minute and answer questions. But please feel free to put your hands up, and I will note, or yeah, put your hand up and we can have a chat. So let's have a look here. What can you do to help with parasites? So talking about something's co-grazing. I think if you're co-grazing, you're just going to have to worm. You've got to make sure that your sheep haven't got any parasites, and I think you have to keep worming your sheep to make sure that they're not excreting the parasites. The trouble is they can just excrete quite high numbers that your alpacas can't cope with. The ideal situation, I would say, for co-grazing is you find a clean pasture, like a new pasture, so tear yours up, start again, if that's at all feasible, and then make sure yours are wormed so you start on zero. The other option really if you co-graze is just do regular feed layer counts of your alpacas and just trap them more frequently. Okay, poo picking, the person who asked this, great, does poo picking as well. The other thing to note, I'd say, is population density. If you have a 10-acre field with 3 alpacas and 5 sheep, you'll be fine. If they're stuck in a 2-acre field, you're going to have problems. Okay. The other thing to think about is when I talk about co-grazing, I think about cart farmers who are moving sheep around. If you've only had those 5 sheep, and they're always the same, always been with you, and they haven't gone anywhere else, or no one else has come in that time, you should be able to treat them all the same and keep a low parasite population. We talked about drugs available for certain alpacas or certain parasites. Good tip from Jenny, first thing in the morning, sheep get up and go for poo. And great tip to refrigerate. So if something happens on a Saturday, we don't want the parasites desiccating. So please put your fecal samples, even if you take them individually, label them, and then bring them to us. And I can be like, all right, you don't want to spend hundreds of pounds. Right, okay, these are the same strata. These are the same strata. This one's 6, so we do 3. Okay. Coccidia, yes, Danielle, coccidia are a pain. Just think about, I don't know if I mentioned it there, when you're feeding animals, the troughs, move them around. So when you feed animals, they don't care where they poo. Their mind's on food. So they're going to excrete, and the critters are running around their feet, and they're going to pick up the parasites. So I would, if I was you, I would move your feed troughs frequently so they poo somewhere else, so the critters aren't going to be running around in the poo all the time. Trichuris, say Trichuris. It's the bipolar, it's got 2 caps in the eggs. So if you look at the papers from the States, they say it very much does contribute to anemia. I don't think we find it quite the same in this country. You often find some trichuris. Your white drenches should work for that. And the other parasite your white drenches tend to work for is Nematodaris. Okay, so I don't see white drenches used much in alpacas because they're instinct, they don't work. They do work in certain things, and particularly Nematodaris, they're very effective. Blood count, we haven't talked mycoplasma, no. So mycoplasma haemolyma is pretty rare in this country. There's not been many cases diagnosed. I've had 1, I think. And it requires the blood being sent off to a lab to Weybridge for a PCR to look for mycoplasma. The animals tend to have been bought in. And that tends to be the history. But the first thing you need to do if you've got a low PCV, if you don't think you've got a homunculus, is to send off blood Do a smear and you might find the parasite there, but then look at PCR and the animal needs to go on IV oxytetracycline. But yeah, I know mycoplasma can be called a parasite, but it really isn't very common in this country, to be honest. It tends to be, you know, if you look at any papers about it, it tends to be from Australia, and that's where you find the problem. Kim, thank you, Jenny, for advising Kim. Really good advice. I do not recommend treating without testing. The only time I do it is this time of year, because I don't want any overwintering parasites in them. And alpacas are not ruminants now; they're pseudo ruminants. They've got 3 stomachs. Yeah, Panicure 5-day course is really useful. So let's see about reindeer work. So if you Panicure, I go 20 mg per kg per os 5 days, and it does orally 5 days. It does a really good effect. What I tend to do with Panicure is get horse Panicure. It's really firm. So if you're worried about the animals going down the wrong pipe, so going down into the windpipe, because the sheep stuff's really sloppy, or the dog stuff, get the horse stuff. You can buy like apple flavored. You need to do a bit of math sometimes to work out how much to give, but it's a paste and they will swallow it all. And I do 20 mg per kg for 5 days in a row. And again, harking back to my reindeer, a reindeer in Sweden, when they import them, that's what they have to do because it gets rid of all parasites, they say. So it does work really effectively, and that's what I used to do with hospitalized ones. 5-day Panicure. So thanks for reminding me about that. It's really useful. 2 down sheep dose is not correct for wormers, no. 3 times the Zolvix, 20 mg per kg per day for Panicure, and for ivermectins, I tend to go 0.3 or 0.4 mg per kg in the injectable. When you graze all females together in a career, should we worm and fluke or animals? So my question is, do you even have fluke? I think a lot of people don't have fluke in animals, and so that is regardless. That's why I think things like post-mortem are so important. Should you worm them all? I think you should worm your crias more frequently, and perhaps the ones actually lactating, or the young ones. If you've got graze females together, including cria, I would worm your crias more frequently, and I'd worm any females that are losing weight. Limestone and partial, another product comparison. No. Yeah, alpacas and llamas are fine together, to be honest. They're both equally not great with resistance. Okay, so that's fine. Thanks very much, Kim. All the feedback's much appreciated. Cool. Does anybody else have any more questions? I feel like I've overloaded everybody. But as we said, it has been recorded, so you can go back and you can spot the exact moment my cat stole food out of the food bin.
I found it really useful from my point. Obviously, like I say, I'm brand new to this, so found it very good. Thank you.
Right, pleasure. I'm glad you found it useful. It's important. It's so difficult, isn't it? With a species that some people, you're not sure of. There's no definite right answers, because we all want the right answer that will create, have a cure. And so, that's why chatting, and it's really good before, and all your suggestions are great, like all really useful. You don't need to avoid any worms in pregnant females at all. Okay, I just don't tend to use yellow drenches of levamisole at all in alpacas, normally due to guesstimating weights, and I think, well, other things work and there's a risk with it. But I know people who do use levamisoles and haven't had too many problems.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right. That is everything. If you have any further questions, let me just put. If you have any further questions, feel free to email me. That is the email address. All right. Otherwise, see you all. It's got a bit cold. Wrap up warm tonight. And yeah, I can't say Merry Christmas yet. It's not December 1st, but all the best. Take care.
Brilliant. Thank you very much,
you.
James.